Welcome to the Los Angeles Times newsroom. I'm Patt Morrison. It is California recall election day, 4 hours until the polls close. We will be here through that and beyond, talking to Los Angeles Times staffers who have made themselves expert in details of the recall, the candidates, the procedure, anything you might want to know. You can put your questions here to us on Twitter at latimes.com or on whatever platform you're using to watch us. Put your questions here. We'd like to know where you're from and who you are so we can get a sense of where the state and the curiosity is going. So please give us your questions so we can answer them and talk to our experts as well. Now, California is always the state that makes the cover of Time magazine, the crazy state of California. What are they doing now? Well, California is a pioneer in many ways, including the recall process. 20 states have a form of recall process. California was there nudging in toward the beginning, and of course it all started in the city of Los Angeles, whether you want to praise or blame LA for being farsighted or getting us into this mess, depending on your point of view. We're joined by Julia Wick, who is a staff writer in the Metro section of the Los Angeles Times, who can talk to us all about that, the origin stories of the recall, both here and statewide, and how we got to this point of having the second gubernatorial recall within 20 years in the state of California. Julia, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
It probably feels like you've been covering this for 100 years, huh?
It does. I know it's been much shorter than that, but it definitely does.
Well, California has always been a place for reinvention, whether it's individual or political, and the idea of the recall that took us to this point today really started in Los Angeles before the turn of the 20th century. Tell us how that came about.
Absolutely. So a doctor named John Randolph Haynes, I believe he was from Philadelphia, definitely a transplant, came here, was a successful investor in early LA, and this was kind of post-frontier boomtown LA, and he in 1898 proposed the recall as a reform, and it was added to the city charter in 1903, so right after the turn of the century. And I believe that Los Angeles was the first major city to put a recall into city law. And after that, about 20 other cities in California added it. And sorry, am I going too fast? Or
no, we're fine. I want to let people know now. Now, Haynes was a very public-spirited person. He was the personal physician to a lot of important Angelenos, including the owner-publisher of the Los Angeles Times, Harrison Gray Otis. He was. And to this day, you may have heard the name the John Randolph Haynes Foundation. That's the same guy. It is the oldest private foundation in the city of Los Angeles, funding social science inquiries and programs. So here is this man who represented good government, who thought that the city charter should be changed to embrace a recall process because the powers that be in the city of Los Angeles were sometimes in all being manipulated by the corporate powers, like the railroads, just the way that we saw at the state level. So what was this recall, or the recall provision in the city charter, and that Angelenos said, hey, that's a good idea?
I'm not sure of the language of the provision.
Oh, but it did allow for a recall of city officers.
Exactly, of city officials. And so that was in 1903.
Now, at first, as I was reading, the powers that be in the city of Los Angeles, like the publisher of the LA Times, thought, oh, isn't this kind of cute? You know, they're just doing their little good government thing, and they called them goo-goos for good government. But then when it was clear that the recall was a real thing and could threaten their power, then they got nasty, huh?
Yeah, well, there was a great quote. What was it? Freakish governance or something like that. But the LA Times really came after it soon after it passed. Not as much as they came after Hiram Johnson, who was kind of the statewide father of the recall. They really, really came after him. But that came not quite a decade later.
And yes, so will the California recall, the idea born here in Los Angeles, and in fact the Los Angeles recall of a mayor reached fulfillment in 1936 when a very corrupt mayor named Frank Shaw, whose brother was actually selling answers to the police civil service exam. It was just a terribly crooked administration, so crooked at one point that somebody put a sign on the City Hall lawn that said "for sale." So Frank Shaw became the first mayor of a big city in the United States to be recalled, thanks to this provision that you're talking about, Julia.
Absolutely.
Now, I'm sorry.
Go on.
How did it get to be a state thing. Hiram Johnson, who was kind of a reformer, Republican, progressive in the mold of Teddy Roosevelt, with whom he ran for vice president a few years later. How did Hiram Johnson get the bit between his teeth on the recall?
So at the time, the Southern Pacific Railroad really controlled quite a lot of the state. It was nicknamed the octopus because it had its tentacles in everything, judges, the legislature, even the commission that was supposed to oversee the railroad. All of it was kind of controlled by the railroad. And so Hiram Johnson was an anti-corruption lawyer who really got his kind of fame. There was an assassination attempt of another lawyer who he was doing a trial with when he was there, and he ended up taking on the rest of the case, and it kind of shot him to prominence. And he becomes basically this real crusader. He runs for governor in 1910 on these three direct democracy his platform of these three direct democracy reforms. The initiative, which any Californian who's ever filled out a ballot is very familiar with all of the initiatives you're asked to vote on. The referendum, which you hear less about, and the recall, which you've obviously been hearing a great deal about in recent weeks. And so he tours the state, giving speeches everywhere, really barnstorming the state to try and sell this idea and sell his campaign for governor. And the kind of really interesting thing about it is it was these ideas that would really shape California as we know it, but it was also deeply personal. His father, Grove Johnson, who had been a state legislator as well for many years, was basically the epitome of a legislator who was in the pockets of the railroads. He had previously been a chief lobbyist for Southern Pacific, and he really kind of embodied everything that his son was railing against.
Boy, you have to wonder about those Thanksgiving dinners with the family.
Yeah. There was, LA Times had great stories kind of in the early 1910s about, so he was elected governor, how people were very upset that Hiram wouldn't kind of say hello to his father, passing him in the Capitol.
Of course, 1910 was a year of great change in California, in Los Angeles. It was a campaign where a year later a socialist almost was elected mayor of Los Angeles. But in 1910, it was the same year that California gave women the vote. Of course, they couldn't vote in federal elections, but they could vote in state and local elections. One of the earliest states, and certainly one of the many states in the West that would pioneer that. And even that was close. It was less than one vote per precinct across California that made the difference. But why were California voters, Julia, so eager to have the recall in the initiative? Did they feel that the legislature in the pocket of the railroads was making their lives worse?
Absolutely, and they felt like there was no check on this power that controlled basically every part of government, and this was really sold as a power to the people, a way to get special interests out of government, which is also ironic because special interests are now synonymous with our ballot proposition process, but that's another issue.
How quickly did Californians take to the recall process? Did they jump right in and start recalling people?
So it wasn't until 1911 that these three reforms were initiated. And I believe there was a little bit of a flurry of initial activity not long after they were initiated, but basically there's been really long lulls. There's been 179 recall attempts of state elected officials since the lever was initiated, and only 11 have qualified for the ballot. So it's not like, people have been recalled left and right by any means. The most recent successful state-level recall election in California was in 2018 when State Senator Josh Newman of Fullerton was recalled, and he's actually been reelected to office, which shows you kind of how political the recall has become.
I seem to remember reading that in 1913, right after the reforms were put in place, that this was a period when temperance, when prohibition was very much under consideration, and there was a candidate who believed that liquor should be illegal, who got recalled and replaced by a candidate who was in favor of prohibition. So the issues that now don't seem to resonate with us were very passionate back then.
Absolutely. And one thing that's also not completely distinct, I think a few other places have it, but not everywhere that has a recall. Sorry, let me start over. Quite a few of the states that do have recalls require you to show malfeasance or that the elected official has broken a law. In California, there's no such measure. That's actually been one of the recall reforms that's been proposed kind of in the flurry of attention around this recall. But because malfeasance or criminal activity isn't required, you can really try to recall someone because you don't like their politics.
I was talking earlier with our senior editor, John Healy, and really a recall is a kind of people's impeachment because people in 1910 couldn't trust the legislature to clean house, certainly, decided that this mechanism would be one way of doing it themselves. But since then, as you point out, it's become a political tool, a partisan tool.
I think it was always political, to be honest. It's interesting, if you go back, when I got on this beat, I spent a lot of time reading in our archives, kind of recall coverage from the beginning. And there are a lot of stories, I think even as soon as the teens, basically saying these three reforms, are completely political, they're useless, they've already been taken over and politicized. So that argument has kind of been there from the beginning, even though the intentions were very, very noble.
I'm talking with Julia Wick. She's been covering the origins of the recall, how we got here from there in a process over 110 years old in California. California is one of 20 states that has a form of the recall. California has used it vigorously. Sometimes it has recalled local politicians, and twice we've had recall elections now in the last 20 years. The first that ousted Governor Gray Davis and replaced him with Arnold Schwarzenegger. The second is the one that you still have time to go vote on today at the polls if you have not voted already. Julia Wick is telling us about the origins of that recall, how Californians have used and misused it. We can take your questions for her at any platform you're watching us on or on Twitter at LA Times. So put your questions to our experts. Ask a reporter. That's the theme of the evening through the closing of the polls at 8 o'clock and afterward as well. So Julia, as you have watched this process unfold from your vantage point of over 100 years, what have you seen that looks different about it, or is it pretty much the same and just the cast of characters tends to change?
Really interesting question. I mean, I don't think I can speak definitively about, 100 years of history. But one thing that I found to be really interesting is that we're kind of, and I think somewhat sparked by attention on the Newsom recall effort, in a real flurry of recall activity in California right now. I did a story earlier this year looking at all of the recall attempts targeting local officials. And as of, I guess this would have been June, there had been 68 different attempts to recall local officials that had been initiated. Now, that doesn't mean they made the ballot. It's pretty hard to get a recall on the ballot, but it means at least some official paperwork was filed. And one thing that's interesting is I think it also kind of has to do with the tide of populist anger, and particularly around the pandemic. The majority of the officials who some form of paperwork has been filed for recall efforts have been school board officials, and that's true nationally as well. I spoke quite a bit with Ballotpedia, which is a nonpartisan nonprofit that just tracks elections, and a member of their staff has been tracking recalls and was super helpful in terms of kind of give me an idea of what it looked like across the nation. And they, I believe, either more school board recalls this year nationally than they'd seen ever before, or certainly within the last few years. Typically, I believe the majority are city council members who are facing recall efforts.
It's interesting because school boards seem to be the public agency that are closest to people, that they may know the best because they have their kids in schools. And some years ago, there was a recall effort, I think in a small city in Southern California in San Diego County, because of an argument over teaching evolution in the schools, recalling the school board, replacing them with members who did not believe in teaching evolution in schools. So any issue, it seems like, is enough to at least generate interest in a recall, even if it doesn't get to the ballot.
Definitely true. And I think COVID closures have played a really big role in the flurry of recall activity, certainly this year and starting last year. One also thing that I found to be interesting is it also kind of reflects just the heated tenor of the moment. I interviewed Ventura County Supervisor Linda Parks, who is facing a recall effort in Ventura County that very much stems from her. Sorry, can't talk. It's been a long week. Stems from pandemic stuff, and she told me, she's never had a worse time of being an elected official. That it's really a rough time to be in elected office. The level of vitriol you receive is unlike anything she's seen before, and I've heard that from other elected officials as well.
When there's a recall against a local official, like the woman you interviewed in Ventura, is the ballot structure the same as it is for a state recall, for a gubernatorial recall? The two questions: do you want to recall, and if so, who do you want to replace?
That's a good question. I believe it is, but I'm not 100% certain of that. I'll check on that.
We'll have plenty of time to get an answer back too. I'm sorry, go ahead.
And the other thing I wanted to mention is that most recall attempts fail long before they get to the ballot. It's really hard, really, really hard to qualify for the ballot. You need an enormous amount of signatures, to the degree that most successful campaigns employ paid signature gatherers. We see that right now with, I know the San Francisco School Board recall campaign, which has not yet officially qualified for the ballot, but they have said they have enough signatures, I believe. They just haven't been, qualified by local election officials. I know they had paid signature gatherers. I believe the DA recall effort in San Francisco had paid signature gatherers. So it's really hard. It's kind of seen as this like folksy, we just went around and got petitions, and there is some truth to that, but it's hard to do just grassroots. Often you need some funding.
We've heard when people get angry about the result of a court case that concerns them, they'll say, I'm going to take this all the way to the Supreme Court. And the California version says, I'm going to recall that so-and-so. It seems like an outlet, an emotional and a political outlet for people's anger when things aren't going that way at whatever level of government they're talking about.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I guess it's worth noting while we're talking about that, it's an expensive process if it does qualify for the ballot. This recall election right now, it's going to cost somewhere around $300 million. Local recall elections are also nowhere near that, but also expensive.
And over the years, politicians who've been targeted by them, and in some cases, assembly members who are up for re-election every 2 years. So it's not like there's not an election around the corner. They've complained about how much money they had to raise to spend to keep their seat just until the next election when voters could kick them out. And in some cases did.
Yeah.
In San Francisco, in the recall, if you can fill us in a little about this, is this about the taking the names off schools that has generated a recall against the school officials there?
This is about many things. The San Francisco School Board, and so I'm going to speak somewhat generally about this because I've referenced it in stories, but I have not been on the ground in San Francisco. But there was a great deal of anger about San Francisco schools being closed as long as they were, particularly I think because of the size of that district, and because the vast majority of private schools in the city were open while district schools remained closed. And then there was this very controversial decision to rename something like 42 schools, I want to say. And those included Dianne Feinstein, Abraham Lincoln. Those were some of the names that were slated for renaming. And by the way, this decision has since been paused, but people were incredibly upset that the school board met to move forward on this before there was really a plan in place for reopening schools. So it wasn't just about the names, but it was about the kind of, it felt, like adding insult to injury to a lot of parents that they were concentrating on this while their kids still weren't back in class. And then there's been, several other kind of scandals surrounding it. The city of San Francisco actually took the highly unusual step of suing the district, and that might have been around March, I'm not sure, sometime in the spring, because of them not yet being on the road to reopening. And then a member of the school board is suing, I'm blanking on this, she might be suing the rest of the district. I can't exactly remember that one, but yeah, there's been kind of many different intersecting issues there, and a great deal of anger about all of it.
It seems that there's one takeaway that you have from every one of these elections is that even losing, which seems to be more common than not, doesn't deter people from trying again.
Yeah. And actually, in 2 other counties in California, the Newsom recall is not the only recall voters are voting on. Here in LA County, in the city of Vernon, which is tiny, there's something like 120 registered voters, maybe closer to 200, but within that range. 2 city council members are up to be recalled, and voters are deciding on that today. 2 Vernon city council members have already been recalled earlier this year. And then up in Sonoma County, the district attorney, Jill Ravitch, is also facing a recall attempt.
Vernon has always been the subject of political upheaval. It's the industrial town where railroads converge, where there are meatpacking places. Very few people live there, but a lot of very profitable business goes on there. So it's always worth watching there. Julia, do you have any sense of where tonight's election is going?
That's a very good question. I mean,
am I putting you on the spot? I'm sorry.
No, not at all. Based on the polling and the ballot returns that we've seen thus far in terms of who has been voting, it certainly seems like Newsom may be able to skate by, potentially with a very favorable margin, but you never know.
And we've been...
sorry, go on.
Oh, we've been reporting on and asking the question of voters about, whether or not they're sick of these elections, recalls, special elections, what they would do to change them. But consistently, voters don't want that power taken away from them.
Absolutely. No, it's something I think that Californians hold really dear. And if you're sick of this now, I hate to tell people, basically the next gubernatorial election is essentially going to start as soon as this one's over. The primary is in June, so this election isn't really going anywhere. It's just going to kind of reset and enter a new phase. You can run, but you can't hide.
Well, if we were to make Betty Davis into a political consultant, she could say once again, fasten your seatbelt. It's going to be a bumpy 16, 18, 24 months. Take your choice. Julia Wick has been covering the recall, its origins, its history for the Los Angeles Times. You can put your questions to her. We'll get back to her, I hope, later in the evening as the evening unfolds. Are all of your questions for our Ask a Reporter program here on whatever platform you're watching on Twitter at LA Times. Julia, thank you for bringing your research and your insights to us.
Thank you so much for having me. It was so fun to join you.
Thank you so much. As I said, we're going to be back with more of our experts probably at the top of the hour in about a half an hour. We've just talked about the rise of the recall, and we're going to be talking next about the rise of Larry Elder, an unlikely and unexpected candidate who has leaped to the fore in the Republican field opposing Gavin Newsom in the recall election for governor of California. This is the LA Times newsroom. I'm Patt Morrison here. Ask a Reporter as we bring our experts to the fore for you, for your information, for your voting information, and for your understanding of how we got to this point in California's always singular history. You can put your questions to us, as I said, on any of the platforms that you're watching us on. And we'll be back about at the top of the hour to look at Larry Elder, who he is and how he came to be the front runner among all the candidates, more than 40 of them, running to replace Gavin Newsom as governor of California. Thanks very much. See you soon.